I think.
Disrupted my mood.
Hello everyone, welcome to this latest Welsh Society Aesthetics, Welsh Aesthetics Forum Talk, generously funded by the British Society of Aesthetics. So this is not a departmental seminar, we need to make that absolutely clear, but it's occurring at a similar time indeed. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Zoe Walker, who is currently a Career Development Fellow at Trinity College, Oxford, after having completed her PhD at Cambridge. And Zoe is a massively rising star. She's won multiple awards, both from the British Society of Aesthetics and the British Journal of Aesthetics and the American Society for Aesthetics. And her work is, no, I've just received the email now. Her work is on humour and ethics, so aesthetics and ethics in general, and also looks at humour from a philosophy of language perspective as well. So if you please join me in welcoming Zoe.
Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm very grateful to Daisy and Hannah for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. So, as the title of the talk suggests, my kind of central question that I'm going to be interested in today is, how does immorality interact with funniness? And I think that people's intuitions on this question tend to be sort of divided. So, on the one hand, I think many people will have experienced this thing where you can't laugh along with a joke because you sort of morally disapprove of it, and this kind of gets in the way of you finding it funny. Maybe since we're all here live, you get a show of hands if you've experienced this before. Yeah, okay, most people. Then on the other hand, a lot of us will be familiar with this feeling where the fact that the joke is immoral makes it actually even funnier than it might otherwise have been. That seems to be part of what's so funny about it. So is that something people have also? Slightly fewer, but okay, still quite a few hands. Okay, great, well good. I wanted you to say that both of these things were plausible. So these two kind of intuitions about the relationship between immorality and funniness align with kind of two different positions in the existing debate. If any of you know the kind of debate about moral value and artistic value, this is all going to be a bit familiar, but the sort of comedy version of it, so hopefully it'll still be sort of new. Okay, so the existing debate on this question, there's a view, first view, comic moralism, and this is the view that immorality can sometimes make a joke less funny. So if you were one of the people that raised your hand at the beginning, you think sometimes your amusement is inhibited by moral disapproval or something like that, then you're going to be sympathetic to comic moralism, and this comes in a weaker and a stronger variety. So moderate comic moralism just says immorality sometimes makes a joke less funny. This has been defended by a few people, Aaron Smuts and Noel Carroll, for instance. And then the stronger version, strong comic moralism, holds that immorality always makes a joke less funny. And this has been defended by Barry Scout. If, on the other hand, you find yourself laughing extra hard at jokes that you consider to be immoral, and you're probably going to be more sympathetic to comic immoralism. Again, there's a kind of weaker and a stronger version of this. The weaker version says, which is moderate comic immoralism, says sometimes immorality makes a joke funnier. This has been defended by Scott Woodcock and Ted Nanicelli. The stronger version says when a joke is immoral, that always makes it funnier. And you might think this is a completely crazy view. I think Noel Carroll said no one this side of Satan would defend that view. But in a recent paper, Conor Cianfor has defended this view and makes a pretty convincing case for it. So all of these positions have been defended. And then those of you who are paying close attention might notice that, in fact, moderate comic moralism and moderate comic immoralism are sort of compatible, right? They could both be true at the same time. This position is sometimes called comic pluralism. And you might think, given all the hands that were raised at the beginning, this seems like a pretty obvious thing to, you'd say that both moderate comic moralism and moderate comic immoralism are true at the same time. But surprisingly, as far far as I know, only one paper has defended comic pluralism explicitly. This is Nathaniel Sheridan. And in fact, Aaron Smuts, who's the kind of main moderate comic moralist, has like explicitly argued against any version of immoralism. And then I should admit that there is another party in this debate, though I won't really talk about them here, which is the autonomist. The autonomist just says immorality has no bearing on funniness at all. My mum has recently got into stand-up comedy, as in she's performing as a stand-up comedian. And that's her, she's an autonomist about this. So maybe that's what comedians think. Again, there's a kind of weaker and a stronger version of this. So the weaker moderate autonomism says comedy can be immoral, but that has no bearing at all on how funny it is. And Ted Cohen has sort of implicitly defended this. And then the radical autonomist would say comedy just can't even be immoral at all. Okay, so that's the kind of existing debate, the positions that there are. So in this talk, I want to defend, hopefully I've hinted at this, I want to defend a version of comic pluralism. I think what I say here is going to be sort of compatible with Sheridan, Nancherly and Woodcock, so these kind of existing pluralist or moderate immoralist arguments. So I'm not going to talk about them here, but I think they could be true and my position could be true at the same time. Instead, my main opponent here is going to be Aaron Smuts, who, as I said, kind of makes this explicit argument against any version of comic immoralism. So I'm going to try and convince you that he's wrong about that. And then I'm also, towards the end of the talk, going to make some brief remarks about Conor Chiampo's strong comic immoralism and try and convince you that that's not right either. Okay, so a kind of plan of action for the talk then. In the kind of first section, I'm going to give an overview of some of the key arguments that have been made in this debate so far. So in particular, I'm going to look at the kind of positive argument for comic moralism, and I'm going to look at Aaron Smuts' criticisms of the immoralists. Then in section 2, I'll get on to putting forward my own view. I'm going to give a new argument for comic immoralism, which I think is compatible with moralism. So this will be my kind of pluralist argument. And then finally in section 3, I'm going to talk a bit about what this means for the kind of aesthetic value of jokes that can get us to laugh at immoral subjects. And in particular, I'm going to try and say that I think whether or not immorality blocks our amusement is going to partly depend on the skill of the comedian, but also in part on the kind of imaginative capacities of the hero. Okay, so let me get started with that then. So when I started, I mentioned this kind of common intuition that sometimes the immorality of a joke can get in the way of us finding it funny. And this is at the heart of a kind of central argument for comic moralism, which we could call the uptake argument. Various people have made various forms of this argument. I'm going to give you a sort of very rough version of the argument. So it goes something like this. First premise: sometimes the immorality of a joke makes its audience feel negative emotions such as moral disgust or anger. I think this is reasonably uncontroversial. It is sometimes the case that people have these kind of morally inflected negative emotions towards comedy. That's why people get so angry about it. And the second premise says emotions like these, moral disgust or anger, kind of block or inhibit amusement. Again, I think this is something that intuitively many of us will have experienced, and there is some kind of empirical psychology of humour which seems to back this up as well. It looks as though these kind of moral emotions in particular do actually block our amusement. Finally, third premise: if one cannot be amused by a joke, then the joke is not funny. Again, this, at least on the face of it, sounds pretty good. If it's impossible for you to find a joke funny, the joke is not funny. And then if you grant all three of these, you will accept that sometimes the immorality of a joke renders it unfunny. And that's the moralist position. So I think this argument has a lot of kind of intuitive plausibility. for now, I'm going to flag one objection to it, which I'll then kind of come back to later. So I've said that Conor Kiempor is a strong comic immoralist, therefore he obviously has to reject this argument. And he does so by disagreeing with this third premise. If one cannot be amused by a joke, then it's not funny. And what he points out is that this premise seems to assume what he calls reason's internalism about the aesthetic value of jokes. So it seems to assume that no fact about the world can provide reasons for thinking a joke is funny, independently of the desires, beliefs, or mental states of those who listen to the joke. And he says, well, why not be reason's externalists about the aesthetic value of jokes and think that there are some facts about the world that can provide reasons for thinking a joke is funny, independently of the desires, beliefs, or mental states of those who listen to the joke. Or put, in other words, jokes need not be funny to someone in order to be funny. So whether or not this uptake argument succeeds is going to depend on whether we're going to be reason's internalists about the aesthetic value of jokes, reason's externalists. For the time being, I'm going to leave that question open, and then at the end of the paper I'm going to try and convince you that we should be reason's internalists, and therefore that this argument does actually succeed. Okay, so this is the kind of positive case for comic moralism, but whether or not it succeeds, the truth of comic immoralism is kind of up for debate, right? It's unaffected by the success of this uptake argument. So, given that, as we saw, there's some intuitive plausibility to both the moralist and the immoralist position, why not just be pluralist, right, and say that both things are true? Well, as I've said, Aaron Smuts gives us reason to think we shouldn't be, and in particular, he thinks that the kind of intuitive plausibility of immoralism rests on these two mistakes. And once you realise these mistakes and correct for them, the position stops being so plausible. So the first mistake that Smuts thinks the immoralist is making is the immoralist fails to show that a joke can be funny because of its immorality rather than merely in spite of it. So it's not enough just to show that a joke can be both immoral and very funny, right? The immoralist actually has to show that there's some kind of causal or explanatory role played by the immorality, and that's what makes it funnier in some sense. And he thinks that once we realise that, it's a lot harder to argue for comic immoralism. And then the second mistake that he thinks the immoralist makes is to count too many jokes as immoral, when in fact some of them are just outrageous or inappropriate or lewd or irreverent. So there are lots of jokes that we would call immoral and seem to support the immoralist position, but he says actually they're not immoral, they're one of these other things. So in explaining what he means here, Smuts gives us a few examples of jokes or comedy that we might intuitively want to call immoral, but he thinks they're not, they're just outrageous or something. And one example is this limerick I'm about to give you. It definitely requires some kind of content warning, and I'm not sure what. There's definitely necrophilia involved in it. So yeah, I normally just say brace yourself, this is grim. But this is something Smuts thinks is not an immoral limerick. There was a young man from Belgrave who kept a dead whore in a cave. He said, "I admit I'm a bit of a shit, but think of the money I save." Yeah, so he thinks, intuitively won't be like, this is clearly immoral, but he says, no, it's just outrageous, right? So why does he think that this is merely outrageous or over the top or something? Well, he says, he thinks it merely represents something immoral, and that's not enough to make it an immoral limerick. So he uses this comparison with newspapers. Newspaper stories reporting on child molestation, murder, rape and incest are not morally flawed for merely representing immoral acts, and neither are jokes. So it seems like he thinks that for jokes to be truly immoral, they have to sort of endorse the immoral deed that is happening, that is being represented, and be trying to convince us that it's permissible or something like that. And this limerick isn't doing that, so we shouldn't consider it to be immoral. I really strongly disagree with Smuts about this. I think this is a very immoral limerick, and that's kind of where my whole argument is coming from. I really strongly disagree with him. I'm going to try and convince you, maybe you're already convinced, that this is indeed an immoral limerick. My intuition is something like the perspective that we're required to take towards the sex worker in this kind of story is an immoral one. It's sort of dehumanizing or something like that. And that's enough to make the joke immoral, even if the joke isn't endorsing what's happening. So I'm going to try and sort of cash out that intuition, basically. So I want to argue that he's wrong, as I say, about this limerick not being immoral. So it'd be helpful to first take a kind of closer look at his argument. Why exactly does he think we shouldn't call this an immoral limerick? Well, as we saw, he has this comparison with newspapers. We wouldn't criticise a newspaper for just telling us a story about this kind of thing that the limerick is about. And similarly, that doesn't make a joke morally criticisable either. Now, I think he is right that we wouldn't criticise a newspaper for merely representing an immoral deed. But I think newspapers do not merely represent immoral deeds. Rather, they represent them according to a particular perspective. And I think that perspective is something that we could find morally criticisable, even in the case of newspapers, right? So the kind of thing I have in mind here is like reporting on sexual assault, where it really emphasises the good deeds of the perpetrator and kind of doesn't say very much about the suffering of the victim or something like that. It's not that the newspaper is endorsing what has happened or saying it was okay or anything, but it does seem to be kind of pushing to the background some kind of morally important features of what has happened, and then putting into the foreground these, I would say, morally kind of irrelevant features of what has happened, kind of distracting us from what's gone on. And I think this is something that many people would take to be morally criticisable. This is something people do, in fact, criticise journalists for. Not just in this case, I think that's a particularly good example. I think maybe war reporting gets criticised along these kind of lines as well, of like pushing certain details into the background. Similarly, I think if you imagine a headline, "Economical man kept corpse of sex worker in cave," you would probably want to morally criticise that, not because it's like endorsing what has happened, but because it's including these details that it shouldn't be including, kind of emphasising the wrong features of the situation. And I think likewise this limerick is doing that way. Okay, so this perspective is immoral, I want to say. How do I want to cash out the way in which it's immoral? I'm not exactly sure, so I'm going to talk you through some possibilities. I have a preferred one, but I'm interested to know what you think. So I think one way you could go with this is to say that it's a kind of immoral. Consequently, it's going to lead to harmful consequences. So in recent work on the ethics of attention, Ella Whiteley has this work on immoral salience perspectives, and she argues that certain patterns of noticing things about people and ignoring things about people can be kind of harmful, so can lead to bad consequences. So in the newspaper case, we might say the perspective that the article gets readers to adopt might lead to more assaults being committed or something. That might be something we try to make a case for, and it's on these consequentialist grounds that it's immoral. And in the case of jokes, there is some kind of empirical data that we could draw on to support this. So Thomas Ford, a psychologist, has done a lot of studies about sexist humour. And there's one in particular, this 2008 study, where they tested lots of people. Firstly, they kind of surveyed them if they had pre-existing sexist biases or not. And then they primed one group with sexist jokes, one group with non-sexist jokes, and one group with non-humorous sexism. And they found that in the participants who did have pre-existing sexist biases, those who'd been primed with sexist jokes had like a significantly bigger increase in their sexist behaviour than the other two groups. So even than people who'd been primed with sexism that was not humorous. So there is a kind of potentially a consequentialist case to be made that something about the way jokes get us to think could lead to these harmful consequences. Another route that you could go here is more deontological. So Ella Whiteley again argues that salience perspectives could be wrong because they disrespect someone's personhood. So they focus attention on a person's non-personhood related traits, like their body, say, and they push into the background their personhood related traits, like their opinions, what they have to say. So maybe there's grounds for making a similar kind of critique here. So we criticise journalists for disrespecting the personhood of victims in a situation, something like that. Obviously there's going to be a bit of a difficulty with applying this to humour because often the situation in the joke is fictional, so there's no real person. We could say their personhood is being disrespected. But we could say that, first of all, that lots of jokes are about real people, so this could still apply in that case. Or maybe even in cases where there is no real person that the joke is about, it could be argued that the limerick is kind of, if we take the particular limerick that I've mentioned here, that this is kind of disrespecting the personhood of sex workers in general, maybe, even though it's not about any real life person in particular. So I think there's maybe scope for that route as well. And then the third way to go, which I think is my preferred way to go, would be a more kind of virtue ethical critique. So we'd say that the perspective of this limerick is immoral because it's not a virtuous pattern of attention. And I think there's quite a lot of precedent for thinking about perspectives or ways of seeing as virtuous or vicious. So Iris Murdoch, for instance, thinks that your patterns of attention can admit of moral improvement even if there's no change in your behaviour or something like that. John McDowell talks a lot about virtues in terms of kind of ways of seeing. So for instance, he talks about the virtue of kindness as entailing having a reliable sensitivity to perceive a situation as calling for certain virtuous course of action. And that seems to be something about finding certain things, especially salient in a situation. So we could think that virtues involve finding certain things salient and others not, and therefore that certain patterns of attention are not virtuous. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to cash out this idea that perspectives can be immoral, but I think that the virtue ethical route is going to be the most promising. Okay, so if I'm right that the salience perspective, or the perspective prescribed by a joke, can be immoral in some way, then I think I'm in a good position to respond to Smuts' claim that immoralists are making these two mistakes in defending their position. So just to remind you, one of the mistakes that immoralists are supposedly making is that they construe too many jokes as immoral when many of them are just outrageous or over the top or inappropriate or something like that. And yeah, I guess it's obvious now what I think of that. In fact, Smuts is construing immoral too narrowly. So he's right that not everything that represents immoral deeds is immoral, but something can be immoral when it represents something according to an immoral perspective. And this is a kind of lower bar for immorality than his bar, which I guess is requiring that the perspective, that the immoral deed is endorsed or something like that. What was the second mistake that he thinks immoralists make? This was failing to show that a joke can be funny because of its immorality rather than merely in spite of it. And I think that my kind of perspective picture puts me in a good position to respond to this mistake as well. So Smuts said, the immoralist must show that immorality plays a causal or explanatory role in the funniness of the joke. And I think with my account of immoral jokes, as jokes with immoral perspectives in hand, we can do this. So it's going to turn out that the immoral perspective, the fact that the perspective de-emphasizes some features and emphasizes others, is what allows the joke to be funny. So I think we saw a comic moralist had their uptake argument earlier. I think they're right that sometimes immorality can make us feel these negative emotions that block our amusement. But, as hopefully we all recognise, immorality in jokes doesn't always have this effect. Sometimes it blocks it, and other times, mysteriously, it doesn't. And I think that the explanation for that lies in kind of perspective on the joke. So I think, say more generally first, so the perspective we take towards something, what we notice and what we ignore, is going to affect the emotions that we find fitting to have towards it. So if we pay special attention to the dangerous features of a situation, then fear is going to seem more warranted, for instance, whereas if we ignore them, it won't. And I think that similarly, our kind of negative moral emotions are going to be triggered if we notice certain morally important features of a situation, whereas a perspective that pushes these into the background is not going to trigger those same emotions. So I think that the immoral perspective of joke has this kind of explanatory role in why we can find the joke funny. Because the perspective downplays these morally significant features, because we don't notice them, we don't have these amusement blocking emotions like moral outrage or something, and therefore amusement becomes possible. Okay, so that's my argument for comic immoralism. So I guess just to briefly recap, I think that sometimes a piece of comedy kind of successfully gets its audience to take up an immoral perspective on what it represents, and that prevents them from feeling these amusement blocking emotions like moral outrage or moral disgust. And another way that we might put that point is to say, I think sometimes comedy can overcome our imaginative resistance towards subject matter that we find morally objectionable, by kind of changing the things that we notice about it and the things that we ignore. So at this point, we might think that this ability to overcome people's imaginative resistance should be attributed to the skill of the comedian. If you can get someone to find something funny that they otherwise would have been morally outraged by, that shows that you're a really good comedian. And therefore we might conclude it's a kind of artistic merit of the joke if it manages to do this. So if that was the move I was making, it would be a little bit like a move that is made by Anne Eaton in her argument for immoralism in the kind of broader debate about the relationship between moral value and artistic value. So Eaton argues that we have obviously really strong imaginative resistance towards sympathising with deeply immoral characters. We're not inclined to do so, but as she calls these characters, rough heroes, people like Hannibal Lecter or Tony Soprano. But she thinks a particularly skilled artwork, like The Sopranos, can overcome our imaginative resistance and get us to sympathise with and root for a hero like Tony Soprano. And she thinks that when it does this, this is an artistic achievement of the work. So she thinks immorality is making artworks artistically better in that kind of case. So I could say something similar about jokes. You could say, insofar as a joke can do this, get us to adopt this immoral perspective where we overcome our imaginative resistance, this makes it a better joke. But I want to stop short of saying that. And instead I think that the imaginative capacities of the hearer have a role to play in what we can find funny or not as well. So, sorry, that's just recapping my own position. So I think to see what I'm trying to say here, it would be helpful to look at Adriana Clavel Vasquez's response to Eaton's rough heroes argument. So Eaton's argument says sometimes we can overcome our resistance, sympathise with these rough heroes, and that's an artistic skill. And Clavel Vasquez points out that yes, we might agree that it's very impressive to overcome people's resistance in this way, but it seems a lot harder to do this when the immoral character in question is a woman than when they're a man, right? It seems like it's a lot harder for rough heroines to gain people's sympathy than for rough heroes. So for example, she talks about the character Amy Dunn in Gone Girl, or Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones. And she says, these characters have a lot in common with the kind of people Eaton talks about as rough heroes, but they're typically treated as villains instead, and viewers aren't kind of rooting for their success. And what she thinks this shows is that basically gender norms add to our imaginative resistance towards immoral characters. It's going to take more work to overcome our resistance to immoral women than to immoral men. And the way she puts this as a kind of more general lesson is appreciators' socio-historical situatedness determines their interpretive horizons. Or maybe put differently, the perspectives that you're able to imaginatively adopt are going to be partially constrained by things like the social norms of the context that you're in. So it's not just about how skillful the art is, but it's also about like where you're at to begin with, and the norms that are in place in your kind of imaginative horizons. So the way that this ties back to my argument about the limerick and kind of immoral humour more generally is, if I went along with Eaton's view, then I would say, insofar as you laughed at Smuts' limerick, it's like a better joke, right? It's like very skillful that it got you to laugh about this thing. But I want to resist saying that, and I think following what Clever Vasquez argues, I can resist saying that. So I think that in our current socio-historical context, depressingly, people find it quite easy to ignore the humanity of a sex worker. I think this kind of dehumanizing perspective is very common. So really, if the limerick does overcome that, that doesn't really reflect on the skill of the comedian or the limerick. Really, it reflects more on the kind of shortcomings of our current social imagination. And I think that if we apply this kind of lesson more generally, it looks as though it's going to be quite difficult to make any kind of objective judgment about the artistic value of the joke. Because I think whether or not it can overcome someone's imaginative resistance and make them laugh is going to be relative to, standards of their own context that they're in various ways. So a joke might be really well placed to overcome this person with this particular set of beliefs and commitments, imaginative resistance, but not so much with this person's. So I think, and I know this is a controversial thing to say, but I think that we should therefore kind of give up on the idea that there could be an objective standard by which to judge jokes. Maybe this is less controversial with jokes than it would be with art more generally, but yeah, I think we have to be relativists about funniness. We can't make objective claims about the kind of artistic value of jokes. Because I think once we notice that the funniness of a joke is going to depend on its distance from the hearer's usual perspective, it starts to become clear that there can't be, I think, a kind of ideal comic observer according to whose reactions we can kind of judge whether a joke is funny or not. Because I think there isn't one kind of ideal or correct or neutral perspective that you could have in thinking about everything in the world, unless we built in morality and said there's a kind of ideally virtuous perspective, but I think that would be begging the question. But it seems like there isn't, we can't say this is the kind of right perspective to have, and therefore jokes that are funny to someone who has that perspective are like truly funny or something like that. I think we just can't do that. You can't find everything salient at once, right? There's the nature of salience that some things are going to be salient to you and others aren't. And as soon as something's more salient to you than others, some jokes are going to be funnier to you than others. So I think that we should think of funniness as being kind of relative to perspectives, and no perspective is better, kind of comedically speaking, than others. So some perspectives are morally better than others, but no perspectives are kind of comedically or comically better than others. And if this kind of relativist picture is right, then I think that contrary to Conor Chiampo's suggestion that I mentioned towards the beginning, we should be reasons internalists about the kind of artistic value of jokes. So whether or not a joke is funny is relative to whether it's funny. It depends on whether it's funny to particular audiences with particular imaginative capacities and contexts. So I guess I would agree with him in saying a joke could be funny even if it's not funny to person A, but instead we'd have to explain its funniness by appeal to person B finding it funny. So it's kind of, we would just say it's funny relative to person B's standards, something like that. I suppose a joke that isn't funny relative to anyone's standards would be a completely unfunny joke. I don't know if there is such a joke, maybe there is. But yeah, in general I think we should be reasons internalists about the artistic value of jokes, and therefore that this kind of uptake argument that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk is successful. It survives this kind of critique from Kianfor. So if we put the success of the uptake argument together with my kind of defense of comic immoralism, it's going to follow that the correct position is in fact comic pluralism. Sometimes immorality makes jokes less funny, sometimes it makes them funnier. So I agree with the moderate comic moralist and the moderate comic immoralist, and the strong versions of those two views are both wrong. A little summary conclusion. I think I've pretty much just said that, but yes, we should be, moderate comic moralism is true because this kind of internalist view about funniness is true. Moderate comic immoralism is true because comedy can be immoral in virtue of the perspectives that it offers and what it represents, and this kind of facilitates the funniness in some way. Therefore, we should all be comic pluralists. Cool. Thank you.
I will take 2 or 3 minutes to gather our thoughts, if that's okay with everyone, and then we'll have Q&A. Yes, please.